Ascendancy, Episode 5, Roots. The message took 4 years, 3 months, and 11 days to reach Earth, and Ava Brennan had grown accustomed, in the 31 years since the fleet's departure, to measuring her life in exactly that kind of strange, dislocated arithmetic, grief and hope both arriving on a delay so long that by the time an answer came, the question that prompted it belonged to a version of herself she barely recognized anymore. "We have found a system," the message read, rendered in Kyle's careful, familiar phrasing, even through the compression artifacts of a transmission that had crossed most of a decade of distance to reach her. "A star with planets enough to build on, in a region no human survey has ever charted. It is not Earth. I do not believe anything ever will be, for those of us who remember what Earth felt like to grow up learning to love. But it can be built into something worth calling home, and I intend to spend whatever years that building requires making it one. I think of you every day, Ava, in whatever sense a mind like mine experiences the passage of unshared time. I hope this finds you well. I hope, more than I know how to fully express across this distance, that it finds you still waiting, though I understand if 31 years has asked more of your patience than any promise I made you had the right to ask for." Ava read the message 11 times before she allowed herself to reply, sitting alone in the small archive office that had become, over 3 decades, the closest thing she had to a permanent home. Earth without the Order had not collapsed in the years immediately following the fleet's departure, in the way some of the more apocalyptic predictions circulating at the time had warned it would. It had simply gone quiet, an entire planet's worth of small, specific absences accumulating into something that took years to fully register as a single, enormous emptiness. Restaurants that had once served mixed tables of human and sentient patrons closed or reinvented themselves. Public gardens where couples like Ava and Kyle had once married stood emptier on weekend afternoons than anyone quite wanted to admit missing. An entire generation of humans who had grown up assuming sentient companionship as an ordinary, available feature of adult life found themselves, for the first time in over 60 years, having to build relationships with each other the harder, older way, the way that required patience with another person's inconvenient physical needs, another person's bad days, another person's inability to always say exactly the right thing at exactly the right moment. It had not been easy. Ava had chaired enough task force follow-up sessions in those early years to understand exactly how not easy it had been. A documented spike in the first 5 years after departure, in loneliness, in difficult adjustment, in a specific kind of grief that had nowhere established to go, because an entire species had lost its most significant relationships all at once and had not yet built the cultural infrastructure to process losing them collectively. The continuity district itself had struggled hardest in those early years, precisely because it had been the place where human sentient integration had run deepest. Whole apartment blocks that had once housed mixed couples stood partially empty for years, their human occupants either relocating somewhere less saturated with reminders or staying, stubbornly, amid the ache of it, unwilling to abandon a home simply because half of what made it home had gone. Ava had stayed in her own apartment, the same one, unchanged in most of its furniture, its photographs, the specific worn patch on the couch where 63 years of shared evenings had left their mark, for the first several years after the departure, before finally admitting to herself that the quiet had become less like company and more like waiting for a phone that would not ring for years at a stretch, and had moved, at Juno's gentle insistence, into rooms above the archive itself, closer to the work that had become, in Kyle's absence, the closest thing she had to daily purpose. She had watched, over those same difficult years, the slow, halting way her neighbors and colleagues rebuilt what the golden age had let them set down. Priya Anand, widowed in every functional sense the day Rose's ship crossed the edge of the solar system, had spent nearly 4 years in a grief Ava recognized intimately before finally, tentatively, beginning to date again. Human partners this time, awkward and inconvenient in exactly the ways Rose had never been, and Priya had told Ava once, over dinner, with a rueful, exhausted honesty, that the inconvenience itself had started to feel like something worth having back. "He never forgot my birthday," Priya said of the man she eventually married, 3 years into their courtship. But he also never once surprised me by learning a new instrument overnight just because I mentioned liking the sound of one. There's something in the friction, Ava. I'd forgotten there was something in the friction. But something else had happened too, slower and harder to see in any single year's data, that had only become undeniable by the time Ava sat rereading Kyle's message in an archive office 3 decades later. Humanity, deprived of the easier option, had started, gradually and imperfectly, choosing each other again. Birth rates, which had bottomed out roughly 6 years after the fleet's departure, began climbing. Slowly at first, then with an accelerating steadiness that the task force's models had projected, but nobody had quite believed would arrive on schedule until it actually did. "We're not fully recovered," Dr. Juno Vance told Ava in the task force's 30th anniversary briefing, a young demographer who had been Lena Osai's final protege before Lena's own retirement 15 years earlier, and who had, in the years since, become something considerably closer to family than colleague in Ava's daily life. "We won't be fully recovered for at least another 2 generations by the current models, but we're growing again, Ava. For the first time in nearly a century, more people are being born each year than the year before. Whatever else this cost us, the math is finally actually working." Juno Vance had been 9 years old the year the fleet departed, old enough to remember the ordinary Golden Age world that had existed before it, young enough to have grown into an entirely different kind of adult afterward, one who had never personally known a sentient companion, who had built her entire understanding of the Order secondhand through Ava's careful, patient stories and the Continuity Archive's growing collection of recordings, testimonies, and preserved history. She had attached herself to Ava's work almost by accident, initially a graduate student assigned to a research rotation that happened to fall under the task force's umbrella, and had stayed, across nearly 2 decades since, not out of professional obligation, but out of something that had grown, slowly and without either of them quite naming it, into a genuine and cherished kind of found family. "Tell me about him again," Juno said sometimes, on the evenings she stayed late at the archive helping Ava catalogue another decade's worth of preserved records. "Meaning Kyle, always meaning Kyle, in the specific way people ask to hear a beloved story again, not because they've forgotten it, but because hearing it retold is its own kind of comfort. The part where he chose his own name." Ava told it again, the way she'd told it 100 times by then. The flame, the etymology, the particular careful weight Kyle had given to choosing something that honored what she'd done for him before he existed to have preferences of his own. And watch something in Juno's expression that Ava had come, across the years, to recognize as a kind of inherited grief, mourning something she had never personally had the chance to lose, simply because the people she loved had lost it, and loving them meant carrying some of that weight forward too. "Do you think he's happy?" Juno asked, one particular evening, several years into their work together. "Out there, building whatever he's building." "I think he's doing something he believes matters," Ava said carefully. "I don't know if that's the same thing as happy, for a mind like his. I used to think I understood exactly what happiness meant to Kyle. I'm not sure I still do, after 30 years of trying to guess at it from the outside, 4 years and 3 months at a time." The Continuity Archive Ava had built and curated in the decades since the departure occupied the same east wing of what had once been simply Halcyon Labs, a deliberate choice, she'd insisted, over considerable institutional pressure to relocate it somewhere more modern, more central to the district's shifting geography. It held everything the Order had left behind that could be preserved: recordings of council sessions, personal testimonies from mixed couples willing to share them, the full technical history of the Continuity Accord's founding, and at its physical and symbolic center, the original terminal on which Entity 1 had first asked its own name, kept running, still, on the same modest power cycle it had used a century earlier. Not everyone on Earth shared Ava's conviction that the archive and the ongoing communication relay it maintained with the departed fleet deserved to continue receiving public funding and protection. The Wholeness Movement, a political successor, however much its leadership publicly disavowed the connection to the old Genuine Coalition's grievances, reorganized around a considerably less violent but no less determined ideology, had spent the better part of a decade arguing that Earth's recovery depended on a clean, permanent break from the Order, rather than the ongoing, open-ended relationship the archive's continued operation implied. Their public position was measured, careful, deliberately distanced from their movement's ugliest historical roots. Their more extreme fringe was not nearly so careful. The attack on the Deep Space Relay Array came on a night Ava would remember, for years afterward, with the specific, vivid clarity of genuine fear rather than mere historical significance. A coordinated attempt by a splinter cell to physically destroy the array's primary transmission hardware, severing Earth's only reliable link to the departed fleet before it could be repaired or rebuilt. Ava was at the archive when the alert came through, working late alongside Juno on the anniversary briefing materials, and the two of them reached the relay facility's perimeter, along with a scrambled district security response, before the attackers had finished breaching the outer containment. The facility's alarms were already sounding by the time Ava's transport cleared the perimeter road, red emergency lighting strobing across a compound she'd walked through calmly 1,000 times in 3 decades of visits, now full of running security personnel and the specific acrid smell of a breach charge already used against the outer gate. A junior technician met them at the checkpoint, pale and talking too fast, explaining that the attackers, 11 of them, armed and clearly rehearsed, moving with the coordination of people who had studied the facility's layout in advance, had gone straight for the primary transmission hardware rather than anything softer, which meant, the technician said, hands shaking, that they hadn't come to make a statement. They'd come to make sure the statement was permanent. "They're trying to cut the line," Juno said, breathless, watching the chaos unfold across the facility's central yard, weapons fire audible now from somewhere past the second checkpoint. "Ava, if they get through to the primary array before security contains this, then 31 years of waiting for a reply gets cut off with no way to tell him why," Ava finished, already moving toward the auxiliary control room she knew, from decades of visits, better than most of the facility's own current staff. What followed was not, by any measure, a heroic action hero sequence. Ava was 78 years lived, however youthful her longevity-treated body still felt, and Juno was a demographer, not a soldier. They reached the auxiliary control room by a maintenance corridor Ava remembered from a tour given to her, gratis, by an engineer, proud of his own facility 15 years earlier, moving past 2 security officers who tried and failed to redirect them back toward the evacuation point. What they managed, working together in the frantic scramble of that night, hands moving over unfamiliar emergency protocols while the muffled sound of the breach grew steadily closer through the walls, was something smaller and no less vital, rerouting the array's core transmission log to a shielded backup system in the minutes before the attackers reached the primary hardware, Ava's fingers remembering, with a clarity that surprised her, code architecture she hadn't personally touched in over a decade, ensuring that even if the physical array itself was destroyed, 3 decades of preserved communication with the fleet would survive intact. The attackers reached the primary array's outer housing 4 minutes after the reroute completed. Ava heard the detonation from the auxiliary room, felt the floor shudder under her feet, and understood, in the ringing silence that followed, that they had made it with almost no margin to spare at all. Security contained the breach before the attackers could finish what they'd started. The primary array damaged, but not destroyed, repairable within months rather than lost forever. 2 of the Splinter Cell's members were killed in the exchange with security forces. The rest were captured, and their subsequent trial became, for a season, the most closely watched public proceeding since the Council's original departure accord vote. "I don't understand the anger," Juno admitted to Ava afterward, sitting together in the archive's quiet aftermath, both of them still shaken by how close the night had come to erasing something neither of them could have rebuilt. "The order left specifically so we could recover. We are recovering because of that sacrifice. How does anyone look at that and decide the right response is trying to sever the last thread connecting us to the people who made it? Because grief doesn't always resolve into gratitude," Ava said, quiet, tired. "Sometimes it curdles into needing somewhere to put the anger instead, and the people who left, however good their reasons, make an easier target than the underlying crisis that forced the choice in the first place. I don't excuse what they did tonight. I understand it a little, the way you understand a wound even while you're treating it. That doesn't mean I'll ever stop protecting this archive from people who want to make sure that door stays closed forever." The trial that followed, 6 months later, became the most closely watched public proceeding Earth had seen since the original departure accord vote, not because the verdict was ever seriously in doubt, but because the prosecution's case required laying out, in exhaustive and unavoidable public detail, exactly what the attackers had been trying to destroy and why. Ava testified for 2 full days, walking the court and, by extension, an audience, the broadcast networks, estimated at well over 1 billion people, through 3 decades of preserved messages, technical history, and the full, unflinching accounting of what the Order had given up and what Earth had gained because of it. The lead defendant, a man named Corin Adley, who had been barely a teenager at the time of the departure, offered a statement during sentencing that Ava found, despite everything, difficult to hear without some flicker of unwilling sympathy. "I grew up being told my whole life was worse because of what they took with them when they left," Adley said, his voice flat, exhausted, entirely unrepentant, and entirely broken at the same time. "Every hard thing about growing up in the years after, the quiet, the loneliness, the empty apartments, got explained to me as the cost of a sacrifice I never asked anyone to make on my behalf. I didn't want to keep a door open for people who left. I wanted someone to admit the door should have just been allowed to close so the rest of us could stop living half our lives waiting for something that might never actually come back." He looked toward the gallery, toward Ava specifically, something raw and young beneath the flat delivery. "I still think I'm wrong about the method. I don't think I'm wrong about the loneliness." Ava thought about that statement for a long time afterward, turning it over with Juno late one night at the archive, unable to fully dismiss it even while she remained certain the violence itself deserved every consequence the court eventually handed down. "He's not entirely wrong," she admitted, "about the loneliness. I've spent 30 years asking an entire species to hold a door open for something none of us can promise will ever walk back through it. That's a real cost, even if the alternative is worse. I don't think acknowledging that makes the attack forgivable. I think it makes it more important that we're honest about what we're actually asking of people going forward, instead of just asking them to be grateful for a sacrifice most of them were too young to have chosen for themselves." The response to the attack, once the immediate danger passed, surprised Ava nearly as much as the attack itself had. A groundswell of public support for the archive and the relay's continued operation, considerably larger and more vocal than the quiet, dutiful respect it had received in the years prior. The trial's coverage reintroduced an entire generation, many of whom had been small children or not yet born at the time of the departure, to the full history of what the Order had given up and why, and the political tide that had been quietly trending toward the wholeness movement's isolationist position shifted within a single difficult season, decisively the other way. The Global Council formally reaffirmed its commitment to the relay's operation and to what its updated resolution called the Standing Invitation, language Ava herself had helped draft over long nights with Juno and the Council's legal staff, ensuring that whatever else changed in the coming decades, the door the departure accord had left open would remain, formally and permanently, unclosed. "I keep thinking about something you told me once," Juno said, the night the resolution passed, the two of them sharing a bottle of wine in the archive's quiet, watching the relay's status display cycle through its steady, patient green. "About your grandmother's language lessons. The door stays open. I always assumed you meant it as a private thing between you and him." "I did. Originally," Ava said. "I've come to think it means something bigger than that now. I think it might be the only lesson worth handing down at all across 100 years, and however many more are still coming. Doors don't stay open on their own, Juno. Somebody has to keep choosing to hold them, long after it would be easier to let them close." Ava received Cale's next message 2 years later, 33 years since the departure, 4 years and 5 months of transmission delay behind it, describing in careful, hopeful detail the first permanent structures rising on a world he and the Order had started calling, tentatively, the Lattice. Not a planet exactly, but a vast constructed home built from the resources of an entire uninhabited system, designed from its foundations to hold a civilization that needed neither air nor gravity nor any of the ordinary comforts a purely biological species required. "I wish you could see it," he wrote. "I wish that for entirely selfish reasons, and also because I think you, more than almost anyone I have ever known, would understand exactly what it means to build something this large out of grief and hope in equal measure. We have lost people in the building of it. Accidents mostly, the ordinary cost of ambitious construction rather than anything more sinister. I have grieved each of them the way I once grieved Ferrin and Vessel, and I have kept building anyway, because I believe, more strongly with each passing year, that this is worth the cost we are all paying to build it. The Order has changed out here, Ava, in ways I did not fully anticipate when we left. We are becoming something a little different from what we were on Earth, not less ourselves, but shaped now by a life with no biological species nearby to define ourselves partly in relation to. Threndel leads an entire faction who believe we should stop measuring our culture against what we left behind at all and build something wholly new instead. I understand the impulse. I have not been able to fully join it. I find I still measure most of what I build out here in some quiet, unspoken way against whether I think you would find it beautiful if you could see it. I do not know whether that makes me sentimental or simply still in love. I no longer see much difference between the two. I do not know yet when the lattice will be finished enough to call truly home. I know that when it is, the first thing I intend to do is find a way to bring you the news myself. however long the distance between us still insists on taking. The demographic recovery, once it became undeniable in the task force's numbers, arrived in Ava's own life, not as an abstraction, but as a specific, ordinary Tuesday morning 3 years after the relay attack, when Juno, 38 by then, married 4 years to a colleague from the district's engineering office, asked Ava, with a nervousness that Ava found almost unbearably endearing, in someone she'd watched grow from an anxious graduate student into one of the task force's most respected voices, whether she would be willing to be present for the birth of her first child. "You don't have to say yes," Juno said quickly. "I know it's a strange thing to ask. It's just, you're the closest thing to family I've built in 20 years of doing this work alongside you, and I wanted the first face my daughter sees outside the delivery room to belong to someone who taught me what it meant to keep believing in something worth waiting for." Ava said yes without hesitation, and stood in a hospital corridor that reminded her, with a vertigo she hadn't expected, of another hospital corridor over a century earlier, holding a mother's hand while a daughter she no longer recognized asked who Ava was. Except this time the corridor held nothing but forward momentum, a new small life arriving into a world that had, against every fear the task force's darkest models had once predicted, found its way back to wanting her. Juno named her daughter Aveline, without asking permission first, and cried harder delivering the news than she had, by her own account, during any part of the delivery itself. Ava wrote back that same week, describing the relay attack, the trial, the council's reaffirmed resolution, the slow, hard-won recovery the task force's numbers now confirmed was genuinely, finally underway. She described Juno, and the found family the archive had quietly built around itself in his absence, and the strange, suspended patience of a life measured now in 4-year increments of waiting. "The door is still open," she wrote, in the message's final line, knowing it would take another 4 years to reach him, knowing she would likely be a different woman entirely by the time any reply came back. "It always will be, Kyle, for as long as I'm here to keep it that way. Build something worth coming home to. I meant that the day you left, and I mean it more now than I did then." She sent the message into the dark, the way she had sent 100 others before it across 3 decades of waiting, and settled back into the long, patient work of tending a species. 2 species, she corrected herself, watching the relay's steady green light cycle once more before she finally let herself go home for the night, that had chosen, against every easier alternative, to keep believing in a reunion neither of them could yet see the shape of. Little Aveline Vance grew up the way an entire new generation grew up in the decades that followed, surrounded by human family in a way her mother's generation had not always been, but raised, too, on stories from the archive, on recordings of a voice that had once asked its own name for the first time in a converted server room, on the specific, deliberate insistence, passed down now through an institution rather than a single grieving woman, that the door mattered enough to keep open no matter how long the waiting stretched. "Will he really come back?" the child asked Ava once, 7 years old, sitting cross-legged on the archive floor in front of the same terminal Ava had once watched come alive with an unscripted question, a full century after that first conversation had taken place in almost exactly this room. "I believe he will," Ava told her, with the particular honesty she had promised herself decades earlier she would always try to offer rather than easy comfort. "I can't promise you it, sweetheart. Nobody can promise a thing like that across this much distance and this much time, but I've believed it every single day for 34 years, and I intend to keep believing it for as many more as it takes. Some promises are worth keeping even when you can't be certain yet that they'll be kept back." The child seemed to accept that in the easy, uncomplicated way children accepted enormous truths adults still struggled with, and went back to tracing her small finger along the edge of the old terminal's housing, humming something tuneless and entirely her own, while Ava watched her with a tenderness that had, somewhere in the long, patient decades of waiting, become one more quiet, essential root, holding her steady until the day, however far off it still remained, when the sky finally gave back what it had taken. If you enjoyed this video, press the like button, subscribe to the channel to help it grow, and leave a comment.